Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show, the 2025 Biennial Juried exhibition, juried by Deidre Hamler, Wendy Earle, and Charlotte Gordon. Today, we are thrilled to present the artist, Lori Kella. As a brief reminder, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode, so feel free to utilize that chat function to ask questions, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end of the talk. Also, please keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there may be some variation of bandwidth. So if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, we thank you in advance for bearing with us. All right, thanks everyone, and welcome, Lori.
Hi, thank you so much. First off, I just want to thank both the Ohio Arts Council and their staff, as well as the Rife Gallery, for hosting both the exhibition and the lecture series, and for really inviting me to hold this conversation. And thank you everyone for attending on a kind of Tuesday morning. I'm gonna, let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay. For this talk, I really wanted to think a little bit about several recurring themes in my artistic practice, realizing that some of you in the audience may be familiar with my work, and to some of you, this may be entirely new. And even for those of you that are familiar, hopefully I'm presenting maybe some work that you haven't seen, or some insights into why I create the work. So the three themes that I really wanted to talk about were my constructing of the photograph, and the possibilities that building or staging the photograph creates in my work. And I wanted to also talk about some themes of landscape, of why that's important, and a sense of place. So in terms of my background, my introduction to photography, most people come to it through the love of the camera. And certainly I use a digital camera, started off on film, and really love taking pictures. But my passion for photography really stemmed from this idea of being a world builder and thinking about creating for the camera. And that for me started as young as when I was in undergrad at Cleveland Institute of Art. I started just, arranging like fruits and various still lifes. And my professors there introduced me to artists like Jan Groover and Olivia Parker that would stage for the camera. And I was like, as soon as I understood that this was sort of a legitimate practice, I was really hooked. My work has changed since then, but the world building is really part of what I want to talk about. Another part of what I want to talk about, and why I've kind of left this image on, is the idea of storytelling. So storytelling is really critical. And in part, that's why I build, because sometimes I wouldn't find the stories I wanted to tell directly in front of me. And there's this dilemma with the camera that what you are photographing needs to exist in the world. And maybe the statement isn't true with AI, but at least for those of us working in traditional or digital photography, what I photograph actually exists, at least in front of me, as a model or a diorama. This particular photograph, it was taken, I did a series called Strange Crossings, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And this photograph is titled Lost. And I just love the idea of introducing the landscape and this little miniature black bear in there. To me, the photograph speaks about the idea of climate change in some subtle ways. Often if bears are coming out when there's still snow because of the change in the environment, things are maybe warming too quickly, and hibernation is askew. So that's one way that this could maybe contribute to the idea of lost, or perhaps, the bear is just in an environment that he is not supposed to be in. So I love how storytelling is possible through building. Another theme that I want to talk about is landscape. So I'm really interested in the idea of place. And as I go through my work, I'll talk about how the Great Lakes and where I grew up really inform my practice, places that I visit inform my practice, and just the general conventions of landscape. So my photographs often have environmental themes about stewardship for the natural world. I'm also interested in the kind of emotional resonance of particular landscapes. So those are the three themes, and I'm going to just go through some different bodies of work, and hopefully I will answer many of the questions that you have, but if not, I'm looking forward to answering a few at the end of the talk. So Um, the first body of work I want to talk about is this one was from a series titled Looking West. And um, I went with a group of maybe 5 other artists. We went out to Wyoming to look at public lands, and in particular, the oil and gas industry. And it was interesting. I'm coming, from somebody who has a very environmental point of view, but it was really interesting to enter this landscape and see that the residents and what was happening there was much more nuanced. That they easily sort of embraced environmental practices such as wind turbines, as well as oil and gas, and people were sort of opportunists. What I found interesting going there, I thought, how am I going to make photographs about this exhibition? And you just saw these amazingly beautiful landscapes, and like sagebrush and mountains. But then it was so beautiful, but I couldn't figure out how to explain some of the sort of strangeness of fracking and different things that were happening in the oil and gas industry, and really hit upon building things underneath the landscape. So to me, something like this photograph kind of hits on all of those things. The world building allows me to introduce my own stories into it. It allows me to create a world that is both believable, but a world that also has a certain strangeness to it. So I can insert the narratives that I think are really interesting and the stories that I need to tell. Um, this is just another example. Some of them got kind of, very, very strange and alien as I had this freedom to really build what was below ground that might not be as realistic. They often pull from things that look like museum dioramas, which have always been a fascination of mine. I still love them, like both our museum here in Cleveland and the American Museum of Natural History are places that I love. Moving on from that, I would really love this idea of showing underneath the ground. And so I started this series called Strange Crossings that looks at this sort of transoceanic crossing, and it shows both kind of the water line and below the water. And so for me, this was just incredibly fun to build this work. So each of the panels in here depict maybe one reason where one might leave home or embark on a voyage. So sometimes it's things like just wanderlust or this desire to explore. There are things like research that might drive one to make this transoceanic crossing. There's like little tube worms at the bottom of this one because I just always, since I was a teenager, had a fascination with these sort of worlds that are underneath. And again, some of the narratives end up being a little more complicated as I start to think about migration. And this work was done in 2014. So it's interesting how much it's had resonance in terms of our ideas about migration. At the time, there were a lot of migrant crossings in the Mediterranean that were happening. Certainly, we're continuing to look at it as a global theme. This one, I just thought I would share a story of why I really liked this one. This panel I actually kind of made for my son, and was thinking about, at the time he was a teenager. He is in college now. And I was really thinking about why he would leave home. And it would probably most likely be as I left home to attend college, and thinking about what a privilege that was, and how my circumstances, that was my sort of exploration and reason for leaving home, but that everybody isn't that fortunate, and many people may make sort of different economic decisions. And so this one is titled Night Fishing in the University. So it really thinks about or reflects upon what is open and available to us, the sort of, I think about it as little Venn diagrams that we work in, where we have choices, but there are limits to those choices. And so I loved that. I also, just for him, he always loved like ocean critters, and we watched tons of documentaries on, squid and things like that. So this one is for that. So, and sorry, I'm at school, so there's a few bells going off, but that's just life here. So after I did Strange Crossings, I really, like, if you look at them, they're really beautiful in terms of the detail. They got, in some ways, kind of hyper real in terms of building these little cities. So in the way that I would construct them, I would pour resin on top, or it actually ended up being soap. I didn't use resin because I didn't want to use anything toxic. So it's actually a layer of soap or glycerin that becomes the water. And I would build these like little, towns or different dioramas. And then the underneath part would just sort of build a construction to be the water. And they got really complicated and gorgeous, but I really wanted to simplify and try to think about, could I make landscape in a simpler way that maybe wasn't as directly a diorama or something you would see in that vein. And so that led me to the next body of work. This one is titled Seven Summits, and they are the tallest peak on each continent. So this one is Everest, and it's made entirely out of paper, just trying to kind of fold and draw on and paint paper to capture the essence of Mount Everest. And what was kind of interesting to me about this series is that these are all places that I have never been. And prior to this, most of the work in some ways responded to a landscape that I had visited or entered or knew in some intimate way. And so Seven Summits was sort of in looking at other people's photos of summiting these peaks. So I'm looking through, the internet and combing through, various pictures of mountains. So this one is Kilimanjaro. This is on Antarctica. So I'm just looking at pictures on the internet and trying to make some kind of approximation of this mountain form. So I'm taking something that exists in the 3D world. I'm looking at a 2D reproduction. Then I'm trying to reproduce it in 3D out of paper and then make a 2D picture of it. So they become very, very translated and in some ways very simplified. This was the only one I made out of clay, just because it was volcanic, and I just found making it out of paper was a little too complicated. But for me, it was really just trying to look at landscape. What was the kind of most minimal way that I could create these landscapes? But there are also every work that I do is on one hand, it is what it is, but there's also these sort of hidden metaphors or messages. And this particular work was really about this idea of achievement. And you think about the Seven Summits. Certainly it's a real thing, but it becomes something that climbers would put on their list that they need to accomplish and climb these 7 mountains. And then maybe once they're done with that, they might choose something else. And I thought about that very much in the realm of artistic practice, what it is to try to always strive for the next thing. Like you just felt like, is it about the making or is it about sort of checking off these different awards or things like that? And I really equated the idea of sort of tracing these lines. There's all sorts of pencil drawing and ink drawing on there to the idea of kind of summiting these mountains, which just served as a metaphor for the artistic process. And again, very different than the work before. I am always continuing to look for different ways to represent landscape, different ways of working. And I think that's what keeps it interesting for me as an artist, is just pushing the boundaries of how one can translate a landscape into photography. Once I completed that series, I started to look back at home in some ways. I live on Lake Erie. I've lived there for a long time. I grew up in Michigan, also like not right on Lake Michigan, but the lake was really central to who I am. And I have lived on the shore where there is a beach just right at the end of my street. And I just started to look at that landscape. And what was happening at the time, it was February, the lake ices over, and there was this really interesting freeze and thaw cycle last year. And so these gizzard shad wash up. It is part of the natural cycle of the lake that the fish die because of lower oxygen levels. And then when the lake thaws, they come to the surface and it starts the beginning of the food chain for all of, birds and things like that. So it is very much a natural cycle. But what I was noticing was that the cycle was earlier. Had been changes in it for a number of years, and really just started to think about the ways that climate shifts are affecting the landscape and the place in which I live. So what I started to do was, I'm gonna maybe go forward one. What I started to do is I made these paper gizzard shad. Um, I had a pattern I can get on the internet for a different fish, a trout that I started with, and I just adapted it to make this gizzard shad out of vellum. So I would print a digital image onto like a translucent paper and run it through an inkjet printer. And then it gets cut out and folded. And I like this one. I've simplified them since, but like love this one because it's an early one where I really took the time to cut out all of the little details. And then I started assembling all of these fish. At this time, I had the wonderful opportunity to attend Vermont Studio Centers in in Vermont and have a month-long residency. So I got other people there. I had fish making parties. We'd have some like wine and like make your paper fish because they take about a half an hour to make the fish. And when I was there, I had this idea. I said, I really want to remake the lake. And so my husband, who is also an artist, Michael Loderset, I came back from the Vermont Studio Center and I said, we got to do this project. You got to help me. And we just created this 10-foot by 10-foot kind of view of the lake ice made out of big cut pieces of plexiglass. The photographs in the background are his photographs of the lake. And then I don't know, it was kind of a lovely way of recreating that space, a very physical or sculptural work, which I have worked in sculpture, but pretty much have transferred most everything becomes a photograph at some point. So it was really nice to make that installation as a little bit of a shift. Here's some other, so as I started making the gizzard shad, I was also looking at other species that were really critical to the lake ecosystem. So the mayfly or the midge is also one of the insects that comes out when it's just the right temperature, it starts to get cool. And they're actually, I love them, some people don't, but they're an important part of the lake ecosystem, and actually having them means that we have a healthy lake. So I am continuing this series. So it started called Ghost Species, and that just looks again at some of the flora and fauna that are essential. Some of them are prevalent, some of them are disappearing. And I really started to think about creating this catalog out of paper. Again, it relates a little bit to these, almost like Natural History Museum archives. I loved the idea that it's not the actual specimen, that it just alludes to it. And these thoughts about, well, what if that's all we have are just like paper replicas of the real world after things have disappeared? Like, what does that mean? And I don't know the answer to it, but I just wanted to kind of put that question out. And so I'm continuing. I've done various native plants and things. That series is just ongoing for me as I, discover new and interesting things that I want to recreate in my studio. Next, it led me to create this series here in which I'm looking at the landscape. So I started to create these ghosted landscapes. The series is titled Vanishing Shoreline. And this looks at the tributaries of Lake Erie. So Euclid Creek in particular is right close to my home. And then also the Cuyahoga. So I would kayak with my husband or sometimes my son into these spaces, and I would photograph with a regular camera. And then I would come back and record the different species that we saw. And so the idea was I was making the landscape very pale in these kind of whites and gray tones, again, thinking about the ideas of memory and that this space, which is so important to me, may not always be here. I also visually started to think about it in terms of just the way that we look at the landscape. So often the peripheral is gone, thinking about what we remember in the fragments. You might remember the turtle that you saw or the heron or a little bit of the landscape, but a lot of it sort of disappears into the periphery. So that's partly the format for these, is really kind of paring everything down to some of the essentials, getting you to focus on the species. Again, this is spatterdock. There were some different turtles, frogs, etc. And I had a lot of fun making these, really playing with light and making these like they're very, very tiny frog and critters in the landscape. And I'm trying to think, I don't know, oops, I didn't include one of the whole exhibition, but it's really nice to sort of see them together as you start to see how these little fragments of the landscape connect to make a whole and really reproduce this environment in some way. I I thought here might be a good time. I wanted to just include some studio shots to give you a little bit of an idea of how I work. So this is a different series, but this was probably a more interesting studio shot. So I'm typically setting up things. I have a big paper backdrop. My studio is at home. I think it's really valuable to be able to work at home. I mean, of course, I would love a bigger, more grand studio. But it's really nice and it allows me a lot of freedom to work at home, especially, um, I'm identify as an empty nester at this point, but during a lot of my career, I had my son was at home, and I had to really think about how to work. So having a home studio to anyone that is an artist and a parent, I think is actually it's really valuable. You can see like I've set up, there's the camera in the foreground. I shoot with a digital camera at this point, and I just backdrops and different layers of creating things. Sometimes what I build is, or every time what I build is really just for the camera. So it's not necessarily making something to last or something to be a sculptural, to exhibit sculpturally. Part of the reason I wanted to break there and talk a little bit about my way of working is, up until now, maybe with the exception of the ghost species, most of the things had been built really as a traditional diorama. And I really love working that way and creating landscapes. So I moved a little farther from vanishing shoreline and started to look at a different aspect of the shoreline, and its erosion. So this is a view taken from Lake Erie. So I would have at the time been kayaking and took a traditional photograph of the view. This is the hillside where I live. So at the end of the hillside, there are these various cliffs. There are some beaches. There's a lot of kind of interesting constructions that people have made to kind of mitigate erosion. There's different balconies, and it's really kind of an interesting landscape in itself to look along the shoreline. And so I photographed it and was really interested in depicting the erosion because similar to the gizzard shad that I noticed in 2018, a couple of years ago, I really started to notice our hillside was eroding. I have lived there for 20 years, and it was just the erosion that we've seen in the past couple of years has been intense. Now, erosion is a natural process, but we were wondering why it is, increasing, and it happens to be actually incredibly related to the freeze and thaw cycle that I was looking at earlier. So as the lake doesn't freeze as much, the winter storms really batter that shoreline, and it's what's been causing it to erode at a faster rate. So I created this diorama. It is about 8 feet long. It took up the whole of my one side of my studio, so I could back up far enough to photograph it, and created this amazing landscape. I really love the sort of calmness and beauty of it. But it wasn't to me conveying the intensity of the erosion. So I really had to think about it as a photographer. How do I convey that? And so I created this, and then I just worked for the next 9 months trying to photograph it in different ways. So this is one iteration where I started to just put lights behind it and vellum in front of it and make these kind of silhouettes, which I love. It has a very cinematic feel. So I really love this piece. So I'm going to flip back. So it's the same landscape, but then again, just photographed in different ways. But that still was not really where I was at. And so what I started to do was take the whole landscape apart, rip the pieces apart and put them on a light table. So I'm going to flip through a little bit just so you can see the process, because to me, that's what I love about this body of work, is that it was really me as an artist thinking, how do I move through this space to get what I want? And so this is that landscape with vellum. I started to love how the light was coming through, and I just ended up skipping the diorama and putting it directly onto a light box. So this is what this one is. This is a different piece that I'm working on, but it sort of shows the process. So what happens is the physical constructions, as well as in this case, different photographs and things, go onto a large 20 by 30-inch light box. And I'm photographing directly on the light box. And that's really how I've been working really since. I kind of back and forth between the diorama and the lightbox method. But for this particular piece, Shifting Ground, I took that 8-foot landscape, just kind of ripped it apart in pieces, and then started to place it on the lightbox with some other materials. It's a mixture of the built-in environment that I created, the sort of miniature architecture, the miniature landscape, but then there's real items on there as well. So it would be a mix of papers that I've drawn on. There would be actual plant material. There'd be fake rocks that I made and real rocks. So really kind of playing with what is real in front of me and what is staged. And they were really fun for people to look at. They're large scale, and everyone was really trying to figure out how this was made, and did I make these rocks? Were they real? Were they not real? And I love that way of toying with everyone. And then also just saying, well, you can just step back and look at the landscape. For me, it's not how I made them. It's that feel of the shoreline eroding. And it was really just how I was able to capture that fact that I felt like the ground beneath me was just sort of pulling away. And so working on the light table really, in some ways, because you're getting rid of gravity. I mean, you have gravity, but gravity is in a different spot, and I'm turning them, making them as I'm looking down, and then I'm turning them sideways, so I can really create this sense of falling, and that I couldn't, I think, using a more traditional method. In that process, I just continue to explore the landscape, really interested sometimes in how far I can push something so it still looks like a landscape. It still maintains some connection. This is again that same sort of shoreline during there was some ice on the rocks and the break wall. So I created these constructions. How far can I push it toward abstraction, yet still maintaining the semblance of a landscape? These are sort of some more continuing from this series. I also started to introduce more personal narratives because so much of my life, the past 20 years, have really been spent on this one particular beach and the shoreline. So just sort of introducing the personal narrative as well, because I felt like the past were kind of left out a little bit of that narrative. I mean, even though there were, of course, metaphors in there. So I started to build constructions, again, just based on different memories or different events on the lake or the shoreline. They're very simplified in some ways. And part of it for me is putting them together and putting all of the images together into an exhibition and seeing how things from the past too, sort of utilizing those gizzard shad again, because they wash up every year. So it just becomes part of that cycle. And it also becomes part of the cycle of my work, which I really love how it can be inserted in new ways, things that I would have made some time before. As I mentioned, part of what I see as a thread in my work is this interest in landscape, the interest in storytelling, and the interest in world building. And for me, I love when all of those things really come together. This particular piece called Archaeology of the Hidey Hole Willow. So it's based upon a willow tree that was on the beach. Eventually it's gone now. But it was so much part of our lives. So when my son was little, he would play under that tree. So you can see in this one, like the top panel shows like a little blanket and there's some toys, and it sort of talks about that sort of that iteration of the willow tree. And then it sort of starts to deteriorate or break down, and different things happen. At some point, there was a paddle boat that got stuck under the willow tree and got eventually washed out to shore. And so what I loved about this piece is that I could pull in different bits of history and really start to address time. And again, the sort of, in some ways, the loss of that tree or the loss of the environment, but also sort of remembering all of the different events that happened there. This is sort of a detail. So you can see I'm working on that light box. I'm pulling in some, natural plant material, as well as some plastic plant material, drawings, paintings, objects. So there's lots of things that come together. It's really akin to working in a collage that I end up photographing. I also thought it was important to maybe put in a few references. So when a lot of the landscapes, particularly with this body of work and the one before that I were looking at, I pull a lot from Chinese landscape in the fact that I love how it often incorporates different periods of time, that you might have something like a scroll, and this piece is much longer. These photographs are from an exhibition that was at the Cleveland Museum of Art a number of years ago that was looking at artwork from southern China. And so, the scrolls will really, lots of times they'll look at a whole riverway and look at different things and different events that are happening. The verticality is always really interesting to me because you certainly see it in Western landscapes, but I think more so in Eastern landscapes, you see this verticality and a way that things are represented in space. And I love that it's not always adhering to the Western perspective and this sort of one-point perspective drawing. And I find that that's really incredibly useful as I build my own landscapes, where I'm really trying to push the boundaries of what we see as sort of acceptable or traditional landscape and sort of pull from maybe more, I'm trying to think what the right word is, but maybe a more fluid landscape or a more fluid approach to a landscape. So in many ways, as I looked at all of these in the exhibition that traced different waterways, I really thought about using that in my own work. So Euclid Creek and the Cuyahoga are, two waterways that I walk through and kayak all the time. So started to build some panels that trace the tiny little stretch of river. I mean, I live in a fairly urban environment, so it's wonderful that we have this Metro Park system that kind of runs through there. And there's actually really an abundance of wildlife in some ways because it's so concentrated. So just this little stretch of river, we might have beavers, herons, bald eagles, frogs, turtles, all kinds of amazing things in there. And it's really been this restoration project as well. So I didn't want all of my work about the environment and climate to just be like doom and gloom. I really wanted to also start to think about some of the things that were really positive about the restoration. But you can see how I'm putting the panels together to really create that flow of the river space. Just a note, these are, again, the animals are made out of translucent paper. It's a three-dimensional heron, and then I'm using some natural materials and handmade papers on there as well. Now this is a real jump. So this is the piece that is in the 2025 Biennial exhibition. Around this time, so a little more than a year ago, I just felt like everything that was happening politically, environmentally, was just a different space, and I needed to kind of shift what I was making to be able to kind of respond to, in some ways, an overwhelming anxiety that I was feeling. So I moved back to the more traditional studio because I do miss that. I miss the playing with light and really like building these more three-dimensional structures. So I started to make some pieces that to me just sort of spoke about, again, these sort of global anxieties, environmental anxieties, parental anxieties. This one is a favorite of mine. It's called Balancing Act because it just really speaks to everything that I was feeling as a parent, a caregiver, a teacher, an artist. How do I hold all of these things that are happening right now? How do I maintain some positivity yet not, be Pollyanna-ish about what's happening? And so my approach as an artist is to make art. So that's what I did. It was really nice to move back to the more traditional studio way of working. And I just sort of created these constructions that have maybe little environmental snippets, little bits from the lake, but again, could kind of toy with abstraction. I had wanted to make this piece with just these beautiful kind of storm clouds and this lightning. And as a photographer, I mean, it's really just fun to be able to kind of get in the studio and figure out, okay, how am I going to, create this like really moody sky, yet have it also be kind of a more sort of abstracted sculptural work too. So lots of fun just constructing these. And I think they just sort of, for me, hit on the mood and where I was feeling. And I've got a lot of reaction to people. I've exhibited a few of these that really just felt like they were capturing what we were all feeling at a particular time, or might still be feeling. But and again, sort of inserting the ocean, or not the ocean, the lake and the lake waves, and some environmental snippets into these as well. So, but I still felt compelled to come back to the light box. So this work in some ways speaks to some of the similar ideas. This is probably one of the newest pieces in here. This is called All I Can Hold On To. And again, it's speaking in some ways very much about the environment. This again traces that river. So you're seeing these threads very similar to the photographs that I was presenting of like mapping the river. So this is just another mapping of the river, but I loved playing with being able to abstract it a little more. So there's these nets that are there. They're just your orange and lemon, like fruit bags that you would get from the grocery store, sort of using those as nets, and inserting all of the different again, flora and fauna that I have built or would see along Euclid Creek or the Cuyahoga. So your kingfishers and frogs, turtles, painted turtles, fish, etc. So they're all in there. And the idea behind this one is really thinking about all of the things that I'm trying so hard to cherish and tend to save, but also this realization that I can't just like scoop up the turtles and like keep them and hold them. Like they have to like live in the world, right? And for me, this was also very much about parenting or being a caregiver and thinking about all of the things that you're trying so much to hold on to because you want to protect them. But that's also not, you also have to let the things like go and be and exist in the world. So to me, it is very much a metaphor for the environment, but it is also becomes a sort of personal narrative as well, really thinking about my role as an artist and a parent and someone who cares deeply about the environment. So I really had fun making this one. There's a lot more painted elements in there, which I'm really enjoying introducing into my work. It allows me to put a little more color. Even though I work in black and white or really like monochrome tones, I'm a person, I love color. So this has been a fun way to be able to introduce color. And again, just sort of toy with our notions of landscape. And so that brings me to kind of the last body of work that I wanted to talk about. I'm really excited about this. So there's an arts organization, the Cleveland Print Room. It's a photo organization here up in Cleveland. And they were on Superior in the Art Craft building, and they have a new building. It's on Lexington Avenue for any of those of you that are Clevelanders. And this building was a former laundry, so commercial laundry site. Many years, I think it closed in the 70s. But they were able to get, I'm not sure if it's super, I don't want to get it wrong, but like Superfund site money to remediate this building and to remove the lead, remove the asbestos. And, it's going to be an amazing art center with galleries, dark rooms, things like that. But also, as the assistant director and I were talking, really wanting to focus on green space and making sure that it's providing some green space, not just for people coming to the print room, but for the neighborhood. And so they had reached out to me to make some work about the transformation of this space into green space, and really thinking about what is the role of an institution and its importance, not just in being that arts institution, but being a steward of the neighborhood in which it lives. And to me, that really spoke to me. I want to do a shout out to the print room and Carrie there for, in some ways, allowing me to make this work. We really didn't know what it was going to be. I'm still in the process of it. So what this is really kind of looking at the history. So I have a little bit, so this is to me a little nod to its laundry history. I will say that it was commercial laundry and it was really more uniforms than like dresses and things like that, but it was a little limiting in terms of what I could find in your miniature, Barbie size clothes realm. But so this is my way of sort of introducing the laundry element of its history. There's a lot of like all the blue are bubbles, are like prints that I did of bubbles that I would create. Um, and thinking about both acknowledging the history, but also seeing it as something that gets sort of buried over time. You kind of lose that. And the whole piece, at least my idea for it, is that it's really going to be this transformation between, its history over here as a sort of laundry, and then as the building is getting renovated. I took a lot of pictures after the lead remediation, but before it's been built out. And then I also have some of the architectural drawings of the new space. And my idea is that it's really going to start moving from its history into something that's much more green and airy. I actually have a few new photos probably since I put this slide in last week, but I'm super excited about this work. And I'm really excited for the potential that it might open up for me to look at, maybe look at different spaces or green spaces in other places around Cleveland or around the Great Lakes, and really think about the importance of place and the importance of environment and the importance of us as artists in those spaces. So that's that's it. I went a little faster than I thought, so there's maybe a little more time for some questions, but hopefully that gave you some insight into my work, the process. You got to see some of the newest stuff, some of the stuff I haven't. I just posted a few things on Instagram. If you're interested in following that project, I generally post things on Instagram as I make them, so you're welcome to follow me. And again, thank you so much to everyone and the Ohio Arts Council for inviting me to speak.
Happy to have you, Lori. Folks, if you have questions, go ahead and pop them into the chat and I'll get to them. So I was going to ask you about color, and then you ended your talk on these really colorful pieces, but I have a curiosity around that you have such a large body of work that really centers this gray, ethereal, ghost-like. Can you chat a little bit more about the importance of the kind of whitewashing
Yeah.
almost of that?
Yeah, I think it's been interesting. I mean, when I first started doing it, I mean, where it's most prevalent is maybe in those the vanishing shoreline, where again it's like very, very pale and very gray. And my thoughts about that were twofold. I mean, one, it was really thinking about the idea of memory, and that, how things are in some ways sort of foggy or misty or disappearing. But it also really was formally sort of thinking about a drawing. So photography is really interesting because we tend to read it as a quote realistic landscape no matter what, in a way that we might not with a drawing. And I think you could easily have a drawing that was using white space and just putting in the fine details where they're important. And so I was trying to think about the photograph in my construction of it, almost like a drawing, in the fact that you might leave part of it blank, that it's kind of open to the imagination or it's peripheral. And then the sort of essential part that you're focused on might have more of the detail. So that was like really my aesthetic approach to it. I thought was really interesting when I presented a few of those as I was working on them. People interpreted them as snow. And I thought that was really, I was like, no, it's not snow. And I've done a lot of icy landscapes. So I was like, no, there's leaves on the trees. But I deliberately kind of painted everything white. And again, it was thinking about it more through the lens of drawing than it was. But that was something I had to grapple with. Like, okay, how do I make sure people don't see them as a snowy landscape because they're white? And that was an interesting lesson for me, was sort of how we read landscape. But that's a reason for it. I once had I had asked someone to do some writing about my work, and she equated the whiteness almost like to like coral bleaching. I thought that was a really interesting sort of take on the idea of like this environment being kind of bleached out. And I loved that. So,
That's great. So something that you've chatted about quite a lot was the importance of abstraction in your work,
mhm,
and kind of relating the nature of abstraction in traditional landscapes writ large, but specifically in photography, and how it, no matter what, you're limiting what you're able to see, and with the photo, how that it can be manipulated further. So I would love for you to chat a little bit more about how you have navigated the importance of abstraction with concept in your
mhm.
work.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, sometimes you're always wondering how well you do navigate it because I think it's some, I mean, and part of it's just the challenge because I think there's both one wanting to hold a certain reverence to the landscape itself, and they have these like definitive objects and places and things in them. Um, and I think it's important conceptually that they exist, but aesthetically, I think I am more drawn to abstraction than maybe a more traditional. And I'm using abstraction very, very loosely, but I actually do like pure abstraction a lot. And so it's always an interesting balance to me of like how much is or how little in some ways can I get away with including so that it reads as a landscape or that so the concepts read, but that I can toy with the space. And I think that's why I love the light box so much because it gives you this freedom again to like disregard gravity when I'm creating them. And I really love that. So I think I don't know that I always feel I'm successful with it, but I think that's what drives me is to kind of push landscape. And I think that's what keeps it interesting for me. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, but that's kind of where I'm.
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah, that's great. So, what I would love for you to chat a little bit more about is your experience with sculpture and the improvisational nature of your work. Because many times when folks work in sculpture, it's to create, as you said, something that stands on its own. Yours has a very different purpose. Your
Mhm.
sculptural approaches are to give you an opportunity to um, manipulate an image. So can you chat one, like, how did you jump into sculpture in this way? And um, what is important to you? You mentioned briefly that it's important not to use toxic materials. What other things are you thinking about when you're making your sculptural work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, there was a point, so or like when I was in graduate school at Cornell, where I was building these bead weavings that I would then make photograms. And so at that point, I was exhibiting the sculptural objects and the photographs together, and I was interested in that translation or correlation of people seeing the objects. But at some point, I suppose when I moved into something that was more of a diorama, it's less akin to like sculpture and more almost like cinematic. Like I feel like I'm making like a stage set. And so um, I often, when I was building the dioramas, like I have the camera set up, I would know my composition and I would just have the camera set there. So I knew what wasn't even going to be in the frame. So I knew like basically I had to make a trapezoid. I didn't even have to make the full rectangle. So you could really think about it that way. And so it really is approached as a photograph, sort of more so than a sculptural piece. Though I have had some things, the like people really actually like the birds and like the fish and things like that, and it is sort of fun to exhibit that at some point. But I resist that because it to me it's an illusion that I'm creating. Um, and let's see, there was another part to your question about like materials and what I choose. So I think I'm not, it's always sort of an evolution. You're like, I don't know why I ended up building everything out of paper, but I guess I liked, especially when my son was young and he was home in the studio and really thinking about using things. I use soap for the water. I use paper. I would use powder sugar and flour. So I liked the idea of not having toxic chemicals or materials in my studio. I mean, of course, photography in itself is its own issues environmentally, but I just think that it was just important. And I love the idea of building the things out of paper, or especially this translucent paper. I love how light goes through it. I love the idea of the impermanence of it. It's really like the photograph that becomes the permanent thing. And these get recycled, they get reused, they get tossed out. And there's not a real sentimentality to the objects themselves. They transform. And I love that they can transform into something else. So.
We have an operational question from
Mhm.
an audience member who is thankful for your talk and is enjoying your work, who is curious if you print your own work or have a lab print them.
That has changed over time, and it sort of depends what's accessible to me. So when I now teach at Laurel School. I've been there for like 6 years. But prior to that, I was at Kent State University, and I taught at Oberlin. So other places like I would, if we had large 40-inch Epson printers, I would print my own work, and I print smaller things now. But I can't always print the large scale things where I am now. So I do a mix of both. I love the control of being able to print it myself, but now I do outsource the printing when it's larger scale.
So you mentioned this kind of um, dichotomy or this opposition of intention versus reception that you had in your coral bleached work, right? How did that shift the way that you created your next body of work, or did it?
I mean, I had to wrestle with that and think, I mean, in that particular body of work, I was still in the middle of it. And I also was like, well, there was a point where I was like, well, I don't know. I'm just going to make this. And if people read it as snow, they read it as snow. And I just felt like, but there have been times, particularly because my work is staged and I would make these dioramas, and sometimes most of the time people thought they were real and not models, or sometimes people just thought like I took a photograph and put like a weird filter on it. And I don't, I, it, that sort of irked me a little bit because I'm like, because it made it sound so easy in some ways. And it's like, no, it's actually a lot of work to build this. And back when I was doing that Wyoming project, this is when I was getting some of those questions just from maybe people who were just seeing the work maybe for the first time, maybe didn't know the history of what I did. And I said, what do I have to do for people to see these as staged photographs? And I was like, put a unicorn in them. So I actually made a series of unicorn pieces to just be like, what can I put in it that would make people see that I mean, it's real. It's very much real, but it's not just a straight photograph. So that was fun doing a couple unicorn pieces. So sometimes I'll respond like that. I think, I'm always interested in how people perceive the work. And it will cause me sometimes to think about, oh, okay, that's a really good question. Oh, you're reading the landscape in a different way. And so it will definitely will think about and take that advice. Sometimes these things on a light table, people weren't reading them spatially, how I was seeing them. And so that was kind of interesting. So you're thinking, oh, okay, maybe I got to put a little more perspective or grounded or horizon line. So yeah.
That's great. It's interesting to hear whether folks take on the responsibility of helping someone interpret their own work, because as you said, sometimes it really isn't the point of it. It's
Right.
I thank you for chatting about that a bit. Um, I am curious, you talked a little bit, just briefly, about the, inception of AI and how that is shifting how
Mhm.
people see things. And I'm curious if you are taking that into consideration as you're building up your next body of work and how you approach it to ensure that folks understand the investment of human hours and
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I think it's interesting because I like, have a, um, um, I mean, in some ways, there's certainly an aversion to just like plopping in a code, a command and getting an image. But I also, there are some artists who are doing some really interesting things with AI and like, feeding, their own work in and using it as a resource in that way. So I'm a person who's very interested in technology, and whether, I haven't decided whether my approach will be like kind of embracing that, and utilizing it, or sometimes it's always going the other direction and really making sure the handmade is part of it. My interest in making, I don't necessarily enjoy making every little thing, but I really enjoy putting the photograph together and like arranging it in some ways as like I don't know, a designer in some ways that I love seeing it come together. So, and I love the quirks that are the things that are handmade, like the little bits of glue or the little like splotch of paint or the things that are in some ways very, very human. So I'm not opposed to technology. And so I don't know that I'm answering it because I feel like there's a duality, there's a curiosity. And I think whatever technology we have, as artists, we're going to respond to that in some ways. And it might be embracing it and it might be going in a complete opposite direction. Right now, the making and the like really kind of quirky aspects are important in the work. They kind of keep them more playful, and more enjoyable to me. Then again, the things that get like I think AI gets really hyper real, so but then hyper not fake looking because of that. So I don't know. I'm always open-minded and I'm curious about it. But I don't know. I'm not worried it's gonna replace what I do. I don't think so.
Oh, that wasn't the question. I think
Yeah,
you
no.
answered it beautifully. So thank you for that. Um, and so for last question, is there anything that you would like the audience to know about your work or about perhaps photography, landscape photography writ large, or anything in general that you would like to close out your talk with?
Um, that's that's broad. That's a big task. I don't know. I mean, I think for me, like if I had to say something that was so important to what I do, I mean, it's actually very fun to give the talk because it's nice to see those threads that come through your work over, 15 years or a decade, to really see ways it has changed. But there's a lot of things that have in some ways continued throughout. So to me, that's really interesting. And I think if I wanted anyone to take away something about me as an artist, of what I think is really important, again, it is that idea of continuing to look at your work, to continuing to ask questions, continuing to observe the world around me and see how that influences what I do. Um, and to me, that's what makes it exciting to be in the studio, is to really, have something new to look at or a new problem to solve in some ways, or a new way to kind of abstract the landscape, or maybe the challenge of adding color. And I think that that's what I love. Like that's what I'm really passionate about, is really kind of exploring and being curious in the studio. And it keeps it from being kind of the same old thing. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And again, Lori, thank you so much for the generosity of your time and talent. Thank you all for joining us for this Artist Talk by Lori Kella as a part of our programming for the 2025 Biennial Juried Exhibition. Special thank you to the jurors, as well as the other participating artists, the Ohio Arts Council's board, the Ohio legislature, and the governor who support the Ohio Arts Council, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.